In 1969, Silver Junction wasn't big enough to hide from itself, but it wasn't so small that everybody truly knew everything. It was the kind of town that lived off whatever passed through it. Trucks hauling parts and supplies, men coming and going from the mine on shift, road salesmen, technicians who arrived with a case in one hand and tired eyes in the other. The desert did two things at once out there. It gave you a wide sky that could be beautiful enough to hurt, and it reminded everyone that life turned dry quick if you didn't have something solid under you. Main Street had a grocery, a garage, a gas station with 2 old pumps, and a sign that lit up when it felt like it. There was a bar where the story was always the same, just the name of the guilty man changed. There was a church with the door always open, and a county bank where the air conditioning was the one thing that seemed to work without fail. The rest was dust, hot metal, and people who learned early not to ask too many questions. It wasn't a town that liked trouble, but it wasn't innocent either. Silver Junction was practical. It accepted what was useful and condemned what brought shame. More than once it was the same thing wearing 2 different coats. The house where Lillian Hart worked sat outside the center of town, along a stretch of road where the lights thinned out, and the sound of Silver Junction became a low hum. If you wanted to find it, you could. If you wanted to pretend you didn't know, you had just enough distance to say it was out there. The license existed, the sign existed, the taxes got paid. Everything done clean on paper, the way Nevada knew how to do when it wanted something to run without everyone putting their hands on it. Inside, it wasn't a stage show, and it wasn't a movie. It was work. It was waxed floors, rags moving, cheap perfume mixed with disinfectant, towels folded in stacks nobody noticed until they ran out. It was bad coffee in the kitchen, a clock on the wall marking when to be on, and a woman running the place like the dignity of every person inside was an account that had to stay current. Vera Doss ran the house the way you run a boat. No time for drama, no patience for sloppy lies. She wasn't anyone's mother, but she was the line between what was allowed and what turned into chaos. There were written rules, and there were rules nobody wrote down. The written ones lived in the license, the hours, the paperwork. The unwritten ones lived in tone of voice and in the way Vera looked at you when you stepped over a line. One of the unwritten rules was simple. The customer didn't run the house. The customer paid for what was agreed to and went home. Another: nobody humiliated anybody in there. Not men, not women, not staff. If a man drank too much and got loud, he got cut off. If he tried to put a hand where he shouldn't, he got put out. And if someone inside started trouble over jealousy or ego, they heard about it too. The place worked because it had a kind of order you didn't always see on Main Street, where plenty got settled with a shrug and a let it go. Most of the customers were the kind you learned to read without anybody teaching you. Men with dust on their boots and calluses on their hands, coming off shift and not wanting talk, just a little quiet and a little music. Truckers bringing stories you'd heard before, only the town name changed and the boss got worse every time. Salesmen who talked too much because words were their product and they didn't know how to stop. And then, once in a while, the others, the ones who walked in like they were crossing a hospital hallway, careful not to touch anything. That's where Lil's job began. She wasn't the main attraction in that place, but she was a kind of frame around it. Lill sang early, when the night was still choosing its rhythm. That was when men came in, looked around, decided whether they were staying or getting back on the road. And music in a place like that had a purpose. It wasn't there to shine. It was there to soften things, to lay a thin layer of normal over a world that wasn't built to feel normal, like a clean cloth spread over an old table. Her routine was steady, almost religious. She arrived early, checked her dress, nothing loud, nothing meant to dare anyone. Hair pinned back in a way that didn't ask for attention, but didn't look careless either. She moved down the hallway with a short nod, took a good evening from whoever was on shift, and stepped into her small space. A piano, a microphone, and a yellow light that didn't flatter anybody. She drank water, wet her throat, tested the sound with 2 words. and never turned it into a show. Singing there took a posture people sometimes mistook for coldness. It wasn't coldness, it was professionalism. Lill didn't sing to be loved. She sang to do her job and go home in one piece, with her head still where it belonged. She knew that in an environment like that, the line between being treated like a person and being treated like a thing was thin. She held that line the way you carry a full plate, with both hands and no hurry. Her songs were old, even for 1969, tunes that sat easy in the mouth, that sounded like kitchen radio and late-night highway. She didn't chase trend. She didn't stop mid-verse to chat. She didn't crack jokes. Her voice stayed low and steady, like it was carrying more than the notes that mattered there. Because a tired man doesn't want to be challenged. He wants to be held without being charged for it. Still, Lill saw. Anyone who works in a place like that learns to see without letting on they're seeing. You learn to notice the kind of cash in a man's palm, the hurry in the way he looks, the fear tucked behind a smile. You learn there are men who come for pleasure and men who come to run. And you learn the most dangerous kind of running is the kind done by someone with a lot to lose. In Silver Junction, losing wasn't only losing money, it was losing your name. A name out there was something you carried like a last name and like a weapon. You could be rough, you could drink too hard, you could work like an animal, but you had to keep your name. Your name was what let you walk through the front door at the bank. It was what made the preacher shake your hand without hesitation. It was what made the sheriff call you by your title instead of your first name. And there were people who treated their name like glass. Never let it drop, never let it scratch, never let anyone else put a finger on it. The house knew that type. They showed up in cars better than anything parked on Main Street. They didn't look at anyone for too long. They didn't call the women by name, because names create ties. They spoke low, paid cash, and left too fast for anyone to picture them staying. Sometimes they came with another man who moved like a shadow. Friend, driver, assistant, a man who didn't smile. Vera handled them the same way she handled everybody, without bending. It was something to see, because outside that house, plenty of people bent for that kind of man. Inside, Vera was the ceiling. The place stayed alive because the ceiling didn't sag. The county had its own ways of reminding people it was present. A health inspector would show up, check the fridge, write down what he already knew. A volunteer fireman might come by, look at the extinguishers, give advice that sounded casual but wasn't. And every so often, someone connected to the sheriff's office would swing through in a way that wasn't quite a patrol. It was a message, a way of saying, we're watching, without having to say it. Lill understood that as part of the job, the same way she understood desert dust and heat that stuck to your skin. She had no illusions about public respect. In Silver Junction, respect got handed out like water, scarce, controlled, and usually to the folks who already had plenty. But there was one difference Lill never bargained away. Even when she needed the money, she could work in that place. She could sing for men who walked in with guilt on their shoulders. She could listen to laughter that wasn't pretty. Still, she refused to be a partner to cruelty. If she saw a customer gripping a girl's arm too hard, she'd stop playing and catch Vera's eye. If someone spoke with contempt, Lill answered with polite coldness, the way you close a door gently. That posture made her an important piece in the machine. A machine like that, if nobody holds the tone, turns into noise, and that was the truth of it. Silver Junction was built out of noises people pretended not to hear. The house was one of those noises. It served a need nobody admitted out loud. And because of that, it was always an easy target when someone needed to look righteous. By then, people talked about change in the country. Some heard it on the radio. Some read it in a Reno paper that showed up 2 days late. But in Silver Junction, change came the way wind came, sometimes hard, sometimes light, always kicking up dust. And dust out there had a job. It covered things so they didn't look too sharp. In that first stretch of 1969, Lill didn't know the town would try to clean up what it preferred to keep hidden. She only knew the night's work, the smell of the stage, Vera's steady hand keeping the place standing. She knew the golden rule nobody wrote down. What happened there stayed there. Not out of romance, but out of survival. And she knew something else, too. Certain people walked into that room like they were stepping onto dangerous ground. Not because they were afraid of the place, because they were afraid of what the place knew about them. Lill didn't come into the world with the name that ended up rolling so easy off people's tongues in that house. Lillian Hart was the name for paperwork, for signatures, for documents, for anything that needed to look proper. Lill was the name that fit the day-to-day, said quick in the hallway, called across the bar, spoken in a night when everybody was in a hurry, and that was how she preferred to live, right to size, no extra, no begging room. She came from farther east, from the kind of place where folks didn't talk much about feelings and talked a whole lot about bills. Her father worked with his hands, like so many did. Her mother had that quiet steadiness of someone who could make a supper out of almost nothing and still keep the house feeling like a house. When Lill was a girl, she learned early that the world doesn't ask if you're ready. It shows up. You either hold on or you become a story somebody tells later. There wasn't any big scandal in her background, no grand tragedy to explain her. It was what plenty of people had, a line of days that asked more than they promised. She'd been singing since she was young, but not like a dream of bright stages and famous names. She sang for herself and for the room. She sang while she folded laundry, sang in the kitchen, sang because her voice gave work a beat you could lean on. And when she got older, she found out a voice could turn into a paycheck. Not glory, not applause that followed you home. Just money you could count, money you could use. Her first real job was in a plain bar, the kind with sticky tables and smoke hanging in the ceiling. She'd sing 2 or 3 songs between sets, take a little in tips, learn how to handle a drunk man without letting it turn into a fight. That's where she picked up something she never forgot. Tired people don't come looking for a show. They come looking for a break. And sometimes that break came as a soft song. Nothing fancy, nothing that asked them to feel more than they could afford. When she came to Nevada, it wasn't for adventure. It was need, and a practical kind of hope. Road towns paid better and asked fewer questions. She had a suitcase, a few decent dresses, and her voice, and she had something else, something more important. She had a way of keeping her boundary without announcing it. In a small town, anyone who announces too much becomes a target. Anyone who sets a line with their posture tends to live longer. That's how she ended up in Silver Junction. Vera Doss didn't hire on pity, and she didn't hire on excitement. She watched how a person looked around, how they spoke, how they stood when someone tried their patience. Lill came to the house on a hot afternoon and waited in the hallway, hearing water run somewhere and footsteps moving. She didn't stare at the place like it was a confession booth, and she didn't act offended. She waited the way you wait in a garage, knowing it was a workplace, not a sermon. When Vera came out, she went straight to it. "What do you sing?" Lill answered plain, said what she knew, said where she'd worked, said she didn't drink on the job and didn't like trouble. Vera studied her with the kind of look that had already met every lie you could tell. "Ain't nobody likes trouble," Vera said. And it wasn't a joke, but trouble sure likes folks who don't know where they're standing. Lill understood. She answered the right way. "I know where I'm standing." Vera didn't smile. She just nodded, like she'd stamped something invisible. Lill's role in that house was clear. She wasn't part of the rooms. She belonged to the parlor. She opened the night with the piano, kept the temperature from turning sharp, helped the place shift smoothly between a man arriving keyed up and a man deciding to stay. People on the outside thought it was just singing, but singing in a place like that was managing heat. If the parlor got too hot, it turned into noise. If it got too cold, it turned into sadness, and sadness was dangerous. It made men talk too much, promise too much, demand too much. Her routine was discipline. She arrived early, talked little, watched a lot. She kept a small notebook with songs and notes, but the notes weren't only about music, they were work notes. Man in the brown coat sits near the door. Truck driver from Arizona likes Hank Williams. Group of miners. No jokes tonight. Bad mood. It was how she read the room ahead of time, how she saw the wave before it hit. And her code? The part she wouldn't trade, no matter how tight money got, formed over time the way a callus forms. Slow, steady, earned. First, she didn't ridicule people. Not the customers, not the women, not the staff. In a place like that, folks walked in carrying enough shame already. Humiliation was cheap cruelty, and it made everything worse. Second, she didn't lie to save her own skin if it meant throwing someone else into the fire. She could keep quiet. She could step aside. She could say, I don't know, but she wouldn't invent a story that got somebody hurt. Third, she didn't accept heavy hands, heavy voices, heavy authority. If a man started raising his voice at one of the girls, Lill would stop playing at a point that drew attention without making a scene, and she'd look to Vera. The house had signals. That way nobody had to shout. Over time, that gave her a reputation inside that world. Not fame, backstage respect. The women knew Lill wouldn't use information like a knife. The men working there, kitchen, maintenance, security, knew she didn't stir trouble, but she also didn't let trouble grow. Even the customers, the arrogant ones included, picked up on something. That singer wasn't there to please them. She was there to work, and that changed how a room behaved. In a small town, reputation runs faster than a car on open road. Only it runs on two tracks, the one you build and the one other people build for you. Outside that house, plenty of folks put Lill in the same box as any woman connected to that place. Didn't matter if she sang, cooked, cleaned. The judgment came ready-made, wrapped in morality and ignorance. Lill knew it. She didn't pretend she didn't. But instead of fighting the whole town, she did something else. She kept her line. She rented a room from an older widow on the far side of the highway. Clean, simple, light curtains. A smell of soap that made the place feel steady. She paid on time. She didn't bring visitors. She didn't throw parties. On Sundays, she'd go to the market early, buy coffee and bread, and be back before the heat climbed. Not because she was holy, because she didn't want to hand Main Street one more detail they could use like a stone. She had her own relationship with shame, an old kind of shame you only understand if you've lived where everybody knows your face. Shame wasn't how she made her money. Shame was depending on people. Shame was asking a favor from a man who would collect later. Quietly. Shame was breaking your word. Lill had pride, sure, but it was working pride, the kind that keeps the lights on and keeps your head up. Vera came to trust her in a rare way. Not affection, work, trust. Vera would leave Lill alone in the parlor for a few minutes while she handled something down the hall. In that house, that meant a lot. It meant if things go off tone, you'll steady them, and Lill did. She also learned to read the layers of the town. There were the dust and shift men, who said what they meant and didn't have much to hide. There were the men who showed up with family for Sunday lunch and turned into shadows at night. There were the guilty ones and the ones who felt entitled. And there was one kind Lill couldn't stand, even if she rarely showed it. The ones who treated the house like public trash while using it as their private secret. That kind had a way of walking in, sitting down, breathing. It wasn't only money. It was fear of being recognized. It was calculation. Choosing a table where the light didn't hit right. Ordering without meeting the server's eyes. Speaking little and listening too much. Lill didn't put a name to it yet. Not then. But she felt it. Silver Junction had men like that. And men like that tended to get dangerous when their lives threatened to show up in the wrong place. That's what the beginning of 1969 felt like for her. Steady work, hard routine, long nights. Nothing looked ready to explode, just small signs. The way life always offers before something big moves. A comment at the bar about cleaning up the town, a handbill left at a church door, an inspector who used to be friendly now writing down more than he needed, a sense that eyes were turning toward the edge of town, toward the highway, toward Vera's place, toward the spot respectable people swore they didn't know. And Lill, her code, held tight in her chest, like an unseen metal, kept singing. She knew she couldn't control the town, but she could control what was hers, her voice, her posture, her boundary, because in the end that was what she had to face, the kind of change that arrives without asking. And in Silver Junction, when change came, it rarely came clean. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, ordinary in the way a road town can be ordinary. Heat still held in the boards and the sky darkening slow, that Lill truly took notice of him as a matter of work, not curiosity. He came in too early to be a shift man and too late to be a traveler who'd gotten turned around. His shoes didn't carry that mine dust, but he didn't have the restless hurry of a man only passing through either. It was like he'd set a time for himself, the way some men do when they mean to keep their lives in separate boxes. He didn't announce himself. He didn't tip his hat with a flourish or greet the room like he owned it. He stepped inside and let the door close without a bang. The first thing he did was look around. Not to admire, but to measure. When his eyes passed over Lill at the piano, they didn't linger. It wasn't the look of a man taken by a singer. It was the look of a man wanting to know whether he'd been seen. Lill kept her breathing steady, straightened a page of music like he was just another body in the room. Vera glanced up from behind the bar for half a second. No surprise in her face, but no easy nod either, the kind she might give a regular trucker. The man walked to a table in a patch of shadow, close enough to the exit to leave quick, but not so close he looked frightened. He sat with his back to the wall, where he could see both doors and the hallway, the posture of a man who preferred control. He ordered something simple, no conversation. He paid right away, and when the drink came, he didn't look up to thank the server. He just gave a short nod, like gratitude was expensive. The house saw plenty of discreet men, but there are little details that separate a quiet customer from a man who needs to be quiet. This one wasn't trying to look normal. His effort was in leaving no trace. Lill caught it in small things. The way he held the glass with his hand covering part of it. The way his wallet never touched the tabletop. The way he checked his watch without turning his body, keeping the room in his side vision. And the thing that told her the most, he didn't look at the women like a man choosing. He looked like a man calculating. She'd seen men with guilt, men with loneliness, men with want, but his wasn't an emotion, it was risk. When Lill started her first song, he didn't react. No smile, no request, no nod along with the melody. He listened, and every so often his eyes slid toward the door, as if he was waiting for a certain sound. His attention wasn't for the music, it was for the room. Still, when she finished, he tapped his fingers once, light, almost invisible. It wasn't applause, it was a confirmation, like he was keeping time on something else. The next night he came back, same hour, same table, same drink. The third night, same again. In a place like that, repetition turns into pattern. Pattern is what Lill respected most at work, because pattern lets you predict. But this pattern didn't bring comfort. It brought a coldness low in her stomach. Not fear of a man, but fear of a situation. The fourth time he showed up, he brought someone with him. The second man was younger, half a step behind, like a helper or driver. He didn't drink, he didn't relax. He watched the hallway, the street, the door. He didn't look like he wanted to be there. He looked like he'd been assigned. Vera dealt with them the same calm way she dealt with everyone. No smile, no hard face. Just the steady flow of the place, like nothing was out of order. But Lill noticed something rare. When Vera turned away, she pressed her lips together for just a second, a tight little sign of irritation. Vera only did that when a situation came with thorns. That night, the man in the shadow spoke to Vera for less than a minute. Lill didn't hear the words, but she saw how it was said. No leaning in close, no friendly posture. He spoke like a man giving instruction. Vera listened like a woman weighing it, not obeying it. Afterward, the air in the house shifted, just a hair. like someone had cracked an unseen window and changed the pressure. Nobody made a comment, but the footsteps in the hallway grew more careful. The security man passed the front door twice. The server avoided lingering at their table. Small things. In a place like that, danger often starts small. Lill kept the songs steady, kept her voice low, kept what was hers. But she filed the man away in her mind. Hair too neat for a working hand, shirt too good for dust, shoes too clean for gravel. And more than anything, he carried that presence of a man who could not be seen here. On the 5th night, something happened that confirmed what Lill had already suspected. A local couple walked in early. That wasn't common. A town woman didn't usually step into that room unless she worked there or she was desperate. This woman came dressed proper, back straight, and the man beside her looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They stayed near the bar without sitting. The woman scanned the room like she was hunting someone. Lill kept singing, but inside she was all attention. The woman's eyes landed on the shadow table, and she froze for a beat. Quick, but real. The kind of recognition that cuts through a person before they can stop it. The man at the table didn't look up. Maybe he didn't see, or maybe he saw and chose not to react. But the younger man, the shadow, did see. His body tightened, and that's when Lill knew. This wasn't just a private man. This was a man who would bring trouble if he was recognized. Vera saw it too. She moved to the couple with her usual control. Quiet, not aggressive, but with the kind of authority that doesn't ask permission. The couple left within minutes. No scene. Silver Junction was good at avoiding a scene when the scene might splash back onto the right people. When the door shut, the room breathed again. The man in the shadow took a slow drink, and for the first time he looked straight at Lill, not with desire, with warning, and Lill answered the way she'd learned to answer. She lowered her eyes to her music like nothing had happened. That was the rule of the job. Don't buy a fight that isn't yours. Don't hand anyone the pleasure of seeing you shake. At the end of the night, once the room emptied and the last men left with heavy steps, Vera called Lill into the hallway. Vera didn't call you aside without reason. You noticed, Vera said, not a question. A fact. Lill nodded. He always sits in the same place. Vera let out a short breath through her nose. Almost a laugh that didn't quite become one. That type always sits in the same place, she said. He thinks if he repeats the gesture, he controls the story. Lill didn't ask who he was. Not because she didn't want to know. Because she understood what a name weighed. In Silver Junction, a name wasn't just identification. It was a weapon. And once a name got into your head, it didn't leave without leaving a mark. What do I do? Lill asked. Practical, not moral. Vera looked at her with the calm of a woman who'd walked through bad weather without falling apart. You do your job, and you don't talk about it to anybody. Not in here, not out there. You hear me? Lill heard her, and when she nodded, she felt that responsibility settle across her shoulders like a heavy coat, because the way Vera said it meant more than discretion. It meant something was moving. In the weeks that followed, the man kept coming. Sometimes alone, sometimes with the shadow. Same hour, same table, same measuring eyes, and little things around the edges began to change. Like the town had decided to take a new interest in that stretch of highway. A county inspector showed up twice in the same month. A volunteer fireman came to check extinguishers ahead of schedule. A man Lill didn't recognize stood across the road for a few minutes, as if he was counting cars coming and going. And on Main Street, the talk started. The talk that always starts when people want to look cleaner than they are. Men at the bar saying the town needed cleaning up. 2 women at the market whispering that things are getting out of hand. A radio man making jokes about morality like it was light conversation. Silver Junction didn't change fast, but when it changed with a shove. And Lill could feel the weight of that shove. People who couldn't stand the idea that their own lives had shadows. One hot late August night, Lill heard the name for the first time, spoken low, almost careless, by a kitchen man who'd overheard the security guard talking to a server. It wasn't an announcement, just a word dropped into the air. the kind that seems to hit the floor when it lands. Rudd. Lill acted like she hadn't heard. She kept walking, but inside, that single syllable sparked something, because that didn't sound like a miner's name or a trucker's name. That sounded like a man who signed papers, shook hands, showed up in photographs. From that moment, the man who always sat in the same place stopped being just a discreet customer. He became a risk with a last name, a risk that sooner or later would try to turn itself into public virtue. And Lill, who only wanted to sing and go home in one piece, began to understand that in a small town, the most dangerous part of a secret isn't that it exists, it's that it gets lodged in the wrong people. The first sign didn't come as a threat, it came as talk. In Silver Junction, talk was the cleanest way to move a town without putting your hands on it. A line said at the bar, repeated at the market, confirmed on the local radio by a man who spoke like he was doing everyone a favor. In less than 2 weeks, you had a truth no one could remember starting. Late September of 1969, Lill went to the grocery early like she always did, and noticed people speaking more carefully when she walked by. Not total silence, something else. That change in tone you hear when folks want you to listen without making it look like they're talking to you. One woman said, too loud, that the town's getting too modern. Another answered that some things have always been there, but now it's gone too far. And when Lill passed with coffee and bread, the voices dropped like somebody had turned a faucet off. She knew that move. She'd lived with it. But that morning there was something new. The talk had a name attached to it. On the radio, between songs and farm reports, they started running an announcement for a community meeting at the county hall. It was billed as a conversation about values and safety. They didn't name the house. Silver Junction was good at speaking without pointing, at least at first, but everybody knew. When the town said safety, half the time it meant shame. Vera didn't go to that meeting. She rarely showed up at those things. Vera said the county building was made for people who liked a stage, and she didn't, but she had somebody listen. The next day, the report came back plain. A man had taken the microphone and spoken like he was saving the town from moral fire. His name was Calvin Rudd. Up to that point, Rudd had been just a syllable Lill heard in a hallway. Now it was a face on a flyer, a last name spoken with respect on Main Street. He was a county man, clean voice, clean suit, the kind who could say family and make it sound like he was holding something fragile with both hands. Married, children, church-going, at least in public. And all at once he was the man saying Silver Junction needed to be put back on the right path. From what folks said, he did it smart. He didn't attack the women outright. He didn't say bordello, didn't say Vera's name, didn't point at anybody. He talked about highway traffic, about outsiders, about drugs that could come in, about violence that starts with permissiveness. He spoke like the problem wasn't a place, but a lack of control over what the place might attract. It was a well-built speech, because it let every person in the room pour their own fear into it. If you were afraid of the younger generation, you heard that. If you were afraid of crime, you heard that. If you were afraid of scandal, you heard that. Nobody had to admit the real irritation was something else. Hypocrisy. The fact that plenty of those same men in those same seats had driven out to that stretch of road and walked through that door on nights when the town slept. Lill heard about the meeting when she came in for her shift that night and found a folded handbill sitting on top of the piano. Someone had left it there like a message, maybe thoughtless, maybe not. Cheap paper, thick letters, protect the community, restore moral order. A committee name at the bottom, and there, printed clean as day, Calvin Rudd, listed as a supporter. Lill didn't tear it up in anger. She picked it up and slid it into her pocket, the way you keep a receipt for something you may need to remember. Vera came in a little later, and the air around her wasn't only firmness anymore. It was attention. She saw the handbill was gone and said, "They started." Lill didn't ask who they were. In Silver Junction, they always began as a faceless group until a face stepped forward, usually when it was too late. "What changes for us?" Lill asked. Vera rested her hand on the bar for a second, like she was setting her weight down. "Nothing changes if we do everything right," she said. Then she let the rest hang in the air. because Vera didn't make promises she couldn't cash. That week, the changes came in the most irritating form. Small, bureaucratic, hard to fight. A health inspector showed up off schedule and asked to see the kitchen. Everything was fine, but he wrote down more than a man checking a fridge needed to write. A county man asked for copies of documents that had already been turned in months ago. One night, the security guard mentioned a car had rolled past the driveway twice with its lights off. It wasn't violence. Not yet. It was pressure. Outside, the language shifted. The bar on Main Street, where people used to laugh about the house as part of the highway, started talking like it was a tumor. The preacher, who used to speak about sin in general terms, began mentioning places of temptation more often. A little paper that passed for a local newspaper ran a column saying, "Some businesses don't match the future we want." The thing was, nobody said names. Nobody said the house. Nobody said Vera. Nobody said Lill. The town was trying to kill something by suffocation, taking the air away without admitting it had its hands on the throat. Inside, it showed up in people's behavior first. The women started dressing more plainly when they were off duty, like they were trying to shrink the odds of being recognized. A server suggested Lill come in through the back, just in case. The maintenance man talked about changing a lock, even without a clear reason. And Vera, who always kept her voice steady, started speaking lower. Lill noticed another change, too. Certain customers vanished, not the truckers and mine men. Nate doesn't care about a moral campaign. But the clean shoe men and the better cars disappeared like they'd never existed. That told her plenty. When public morality flares up, the ones with the most to lose run first. Calvin Rudd didn't run, though. Not really. He stopped showing up as a customer. Yes, the shadow table went empty, but he appeared everywhere else as a voice. His name started moving through town with a kind of energy. Rudd's trying to straighten things out. Rudd's doing what nobody had the guts to do. Rudd's going to run for something bigger, they say. The moral campaign was turning into a platform. That's when Lill understood this wasn't just church talk and radio noise. There was a plan behind it, an aim. And when a man turns morality into a plan, somebody always becomes collateral. One October night, Sheriff Wade Harlan came by, not to arrest anybody, not to put on a show. He came in the way a man comes into an office, nodded at Vera, stood at the bar a few minutes, drank coffee. Wade didn't usually come like that. When he did, it was because he wanted it known he'd been there. Vera served him. They spoke low. Lill couldn't hear the words from the piano, but she could read the shape of it. Wade talked with his hand open, like he was offering options. Vera answered with her head. No smile. Wade looked around once, slow, then walked back out. After the door closed, Vera stood still for a beat, like she was counting to 10. "He came to warn me," she said, when Lill drifted closer. "Warn you about what?" Vera didn't answer right away. She picked up a cloth and started polishing a glass that was already clean. Something a person does when they need their hands to look calm. "That they're gonna start making visits," she said, "their way." She lifted her eyes to Lill, "And we can't give them a reason." It sounded reasonable on the surface, but Lill heard what lived underneath. "They'll come, even if we don't give them a reason." That same week, a county man showed up with a clipboard and asked about fire extinguishers, exits, emergency lighting. The house had it all, always had, but he wrote like he was searching for a flaw in a smooth wall. Then he asked for old records, maintenance, purchases, payments. Vera handed over what she could, and Lill saw the man's eyes move across those pages like he wasn't reading numbers. He was looking for names. Right then, Lill understood something plain. The moral campaign didn't need to prove sin. It needed to prove influence. It needed a way to say, "See, this is a problem," and turn that into public action. In a small town, public action is serious theater with real consequences. Lill went back to the piano that night and sang like she always did, but inside, her voice carried a new caution. She chose calmer songs, less laughter, more highway, because when the world starts tightening around you, you learn to lower the sparks. After the shift, walking home under a sky too big for so many small lies, Lill felt the weight of something that didn't have a shape yet, a kind of threat that didn't come with a gun at the door, but with paper, speeches, and respectable smiles sharpening a knife. For the first time, she wondered, never out loud, because in Silver Junction loud questions become trouble, how long it takes a town to decide a place needs to burn, even if nobody strikes a match. She didn't know then that fire would come for real, but she could already tell the town was preparing the ground to call any loss cleaning, and that was the dangerous part, because when a community starts calling destruction cleanup, it gives itself permission to do things it would have called a crime on any other day. In Silver Junction, when somebody wanted to take you down, they rarely started with a shove. They started by measuring your structure, looking for the board that had aged, the screw that already spun loose, and once they found it, they didn't have to shout. They just tightened, day after day, until you started believing it was your own fault when you finally gave. After the moral campaign got a name and a face, the county began showing up at the house with a frequency that wasn't coincident. It wasn't violent, no sirens, no raid. It was the kind of presence that looks normal on paper. Inspections, checks, updating files. Only it came one after the other. Always with a new requirement, always with an observation that left you feeling like somebody was building a folder with your name on it. The first week of November, 2 men arrived with folders and boots, too clean. One introduced himself as from the county office. Without saying much else, he asked to see the license documentation again, payment records, dates. Vera brought out a box of files as neat as everything she did. No frills, no gaps. Still, the man flipped through them like he was hunting for something that wasn't written. "You always keep it this tidy?" he asked. Vera answered, calm. "I keep it that way because it's my job." The man made a short sound through his nose, almost a laugh swallowed down, not admiration, the sound of someone who'd rather find a mess. The second man spent more time looking at the parlor itself, the doors, the hallway that led to the rooms. He measured distance with his eyes. He wrote down how many lights, where the extinguishers hung, how many steps in a side passage. Fire inspection, they said. Only it wasn't a scheduled day, and it wasn't the kind of check a local volunteer would do. It was professional. It was attention. After that came the changes that hit the day-to-day. A notice asking for new lighting in an area that had always been lit, a demand for extra signage at the back exit, a recommendation to redo part of the wiring for safety. All of it plausible, all of it expensive, and always with a short deadline. As if the house had been careless until yesterday, when it hadn't. Vera did the math in silence. She didn't complain out loud, but Lill could tell. Vera would run her finger along the edge of the bar, the same small motion over and over. It was the motion of a woman thinking, how long can I hold this without missing payroll, without leaving anybody here unpaid? What made it clearer wasn't an inspection. It was an offer. Earl Sutter showed up one afternoon before the house opened. Thin man, hair slicked back, shirt pressed sharp. He talked like a man selling insurance, voice always calm, like he was protecting you from your own bad luck. He said he worked with county matters, helping with organization and transition for local businesses. Towns changing, he said, like he was talking about weather. There are people interested in doing things more suitable for the future. Vera didn't invite him to sit. She stayed standing, arms folded. "And what's that got to do with me?" Earl smiled like he'd gotten the question he wanted. "It's about options, about arrangements. If you'd have any interest in selling or converting the business to a new format, I can bring you the right people." Vera didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "My business is legal," she said. "I pay taxes. I follow the rules. If the town wants change, it can change inside the law." Earl nodded like he agreed, but his eyes didn't. "Of course, inside the law." He opened his folder and slid forward a list of required upgrades. that just happened to match exactly what the inspections had started demanding. Only the law sometimes shifts, and it can shift fast. It wasn't an offer to buy out of goodwill. It was an offer to buy out of pain. And in Silver Junction, that was a kind of robbery done with a pen. After Earl left, Vera stood quiet a long moment. Then she called Lill and 2 others into the kitchen, not to dramatize, but to set terms. From now on, nobody signs anything without me seeing it. Nobody talks to a county man without me there. And nobody takes paperwork off this property. Understand? Lill understood by Vera's tone. Vera wasn't just guarding against a fine. She was guarding against a trap. The following weeks brought another shift. The sheriff started passing by more. Wade Harlan didn't come in to drink coffee anymore. His car rolled slow past the driveway, like he was marking the place. One night he stepped inside, looked the room over, said 2 low sentences to Vera, and walked out. No arrests, no notes. But the message landed anyway. We're here. And once law enforcement is here, the town starts acting like something must already be wrong. Lill felt it in the customers. The dust and shift men still came, but quieter. Some avoided the parlor and asked to sit where they couldn't be seen as easily, like they were ashamed of being spotted. Others, the respectable ones, vanished for good, and that was the cruel part. When they disappeared, the moral talk got easier, because now it looked like only outsiders remained. People without names, people who didn't matter. That's how a town prepares to justify what it's about to do. The local radio began giving regular time to the Values Committee. Calvin Rudd had a weekly spot where he talked about the future, about youth, about the need for order. He didn't have to name the house. He could say certain influences, and everyone understood. Each time he spoke, it felt like the town was being granted permission to look at that stretch of road like an enemy, not a business that had lived under the same sun for years. And the county knew where to press. A liquor supplier called to say they wouldn't deliver anymore per company recommendation. A mechanic who used to take care of small fixes started postponing, claiming he was booked. A man who delivered gas and oil said he'd heard bad things and didn't want to get involved. It was a boycott without a signature. Vera started paying more to bring supplies from farther out, and it squeezed what little margin there was. Lill saw Vera writing numbers on a sheet and then tearing the sheet in half, like she was angry she had to think about money when what they were fighting for was survival. One night, during a break between songs, an older regular, a minor, hard face, cracked hands, left a tip on the edge of the piano that was larger than usual. Lill tried to refuse. "Take it," he said, low, almost sharp. "You're gonna need it." That hurt more than any insult, because it came from a man who didn't have extra. And when a man like that gives, it's because he understands something serious is coming. The squeeze changed the inside of the house, too. People started storing things in odd places, keeping bags closed, talking less about anyone's routine. Not paranoia, instinct. Silver Junction was creating a climate where any small detail could become ammunition. And then Lill saw the piece that tied it all together. The moral campaign was producing clear winners. A notice appeared in the local paper about a revitalization project near the highway. It talked about building a little strip of shops and a bigger gas station, maybe even a new motel. The writing was full of pretty vague words, but a small map showed the area, and it wasn't far from Vera's property. When Lill saw that map, she understood what Earl Sutter really was. Not only a messenger, a point man, the kind who shows up before land changes hands, before zoning shifts, before a council decision nobody regular can stop. Morality was the background music. Money was the lyrics. One early morning after closing, Lill stepped outside into the cold desert air and saw headlights stopped out on the edge of the road. The car didn't pull in. It just sat there, quiet, like it was watching. Then it rolled away. She walked home with her coat pulled tight, thinking one plain thought: when a town decides you are the problem, It doesn't need to prove you're guilty. It only needs to make your life impossible. The next day, Vera got another envelope from the county. Inside was a new inspection notice and an updated list of requirements, with short deadlines and long penalties. Vera read it without changing her face, folded it neatly, and set it on the bar. "They want to wear me down," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "They want me to quit on my own." Lill looked at the empty parlor, the piano, the yellow light that made everything look older than it was. She thought about the work, the rhythm she'd built there, the dignity Vera kept fighting to maintain. And for the first time, Lill felt it clean and sure. The problem had moved past misbehavior. This was a larger machine. People gaining and people losing. Radio talk and stamped paper, a threat that didn't have to be spoken because it was written in dead lines. Silver Junction rarely exploded all at once. It tightened until something snapped, and when it snapped, the town called it inevitable. That night, when Lill sat at the piano and began to sing, she understood the music had changed jobs. Before, it softened the edges. Now it covered the sound of something being assembled outside, piece by piece. And when a community starts assembling something like that, it has usually already decided who's going to be left holding the ashes. Evie Crane wasn't the kind of person who just vanished without leaving a mark. Not because she mattered to Main Street. Main Street saw her as exactly the kind of woman who comes and goes and isn't worth tracking, but because she had a routine. And in hard work, routine is what keeps you upright. Evie was in her 20s, maybe 27, maybe 28. Exact ages weren't much of a topic in that house. Asking could feel like prying. She had dark hair she usually pinned up fast, and a short, sharp laugh that showed up more on quieter days than during a shift. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't pick fights. She worked, saved when she could, complained less than most. When she talked about leaving, she did it without fantasy. She said she wanted a place where she could walk down the street without feeling someone weigh her worth with their eyes. Lill liked Evie for one plain reason. Evie didn't pretend. She didn't put on happiness and she didn't put on tragedy. She was a working woman trying to get through the world the best way she knew. Same as everyone in that building. The disappearance happened in a week when the house was already living under the county's squeeze. Inspections, paperwork, deadlines. Tension had become part of the air, like disinfectant in the hallway. Still, that Thursday began like any other. Lill sang early, did 2 calm songs, watched men come in with the same tired look. Vera stayed behind the bar, steady, watching the parlor like she was counting breaths. Evie showed up a little late, which wasn't like her. She gave a quick apology with her hand, disappeared down the hallway, and came back a few minutes later with her dress fixed in a hurry and her hair pinned any which way. Lill noticed a small bruise near Evie's wrist, almost hidden under makeup. Evie caught Lil's eye, and without offering anything more, said low, "Car door shut wrong." It was the standard answer for, "Don't ask." Lill didn't push. Work was work, and not every heart has room for questions. Near midnight, something odd happened at the entrance. Not noise, organization. A car stopped and kept the engine running too long. A man came in and spoke to the security guard in a low voice, without ordering a drink, without looking around. The guard nodded once and signaled Vera. Vera went to the door, talked for less than a minute, then came back with the face she wore when she had to make a quick decision. She called Evie into the hallway. Lill saw it from the piano. She didn't hear the words, but she saw Evie go still for a beat, like she'd swallowed hard. Then Evie made a small hand motion, half okay, half no choice, grabbed her purse and headed toward the back. At first, Lill thought it might be something quick, a ride, a message, a problem to handle and return from. In that house, plenty of things were urgent, but not unusual, until they became unusual. Evie didn't come back. No one panicked right away. People moved in and out of that place all the time, but half an hour passed, then an hour. Vera checked the clock twice, which she rarely did. During a break between songs, Lill watched Vera speak with the security guard in a short, hard way. The guard went outside and stayed gone long enough for the air to change. When he came back, his face had closed. After the place shut down, Vera did something Lill had never seen. She pulled everyone into the kitchen and asked, quiet but firm, who saw Evie last? The silence that followed wasn't guilt. It was fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of bringing trouble on yourself. A server said he'd seen Evie head out back with her purse. The cleaning girl said Evie left a coat in her locker. The security guard confirmed a car had been there, but said he didn't recognize the driver. Vera stared at the kitchen table like an answer might be written on it. She wouldn't leave without her coat, Vera said, mostly to herself, and that's when Lill felt the floor shift, because Vera was right. Evie complained about the cold all the time. She wouldn't leave a coat behind. She wouldn't leave her brush. She wouldn't leave those comfortable shoes she kept for after her shift. The next morning, Vera made 2 calls, one to a hospital in a nearby town, and one to the sheriff's office. The hospital said no one had come in. The sheriff's office answered with impatience, like Vera was calling to ask mail hours. Adults disappear because they want to, the voice said. If she's in trouble, she'll show. Vera hung up without a thank you. Then she did the second unusual thing. She went to the sheriff's office in person that afternoon, leaving the property with someone else for a few hours. When she came back, her face looked stiff as dry wood. They're not going to do anything, Vera said. Lill didn't ask who they were. She already knew. In the days after, the town built the official story around Evie the way you build a fence, fast, so there's no gap left for doubt. Somebody said she'd gone to Reno. Somebody else said she'd found a man and taken off with him. A woman at the grocery remarked, "Those girls are always running." The preacher spoke in a sermon about consequences, without naming anyone, and the little local paper printed a short note about a voluntary departure of employee from licensed establishment, like it was a normal business update. That's how Silver Junction swallowed a person, by turning her into a sentence. Lill tried to do what she could without putting herself on a hook. She asked a trucker who sometimes talked with Evie if he'd seen anything. He hadn't. She asked Hank Mercer, the volunteer fireman who also ran an auto shop, if anyone had come in needing urgent work on a car that night. Hank shook his head slowly, thinking, "Cars come through here every day," he said. "But this week there's folks driving like they're in a hurry to forget." It wasn't proof, but in a small place, a line like that had weight. Lill began noticing the kinds of details that seem useless until they aren't. Evie's coat stayed in the locker. Her cheap perfume sat where it always had. Her comb with 2 broken teeth, something she complained about but never threw away, was still there. Absence showed itself in what remained. In the parlor, her missing presence changed the rhythm. A chair always seemed to be waiting for someone who wasn't coming. A laugh was gone, and the fear, which had already been a whisper, turned into behavior. The women started going out back in pairs. The security guard stayed closer to the door. Vera began writing down license plates of cars that idled too long. But the hardest thing was seeing how quickly the town started erasing her. No posters, no announcements, no search, only that silent agreement, better not to mess with it. Lill recognized the mechanism with a clarity that hurt. When a town doesn't want a truth, it doesn't need to lie loudly. It only needs to tire out whoever asks. One night, near closing, an old miner stood at the bar while Lill put away her music. He drank coffee, not liquor, and looked out the window toward the dark highway. "When somebody disappears around here," he said without looking at anyone, "it's because somebody with a name decided she didn't need to be here anymore." He didn't say sheriff. He didn't say Rudd. He didn't say county. He didn't need to. In a town like that, the map draws itself. Lill walked home that night with a metallic taste in her mouth, like she'd been breathing smoke. She passed the closed grocery, the dark church, the bank with its lights off. Everything looked the same, and nothing was the same. Because now she had a question she couldn't ask out loud. Who decides who counts? The next day, Vera received another inspection notice. Date, stamp, signature, a polite reminder that the squeeze was still on. And Lill understood, cold and clear, how things were connecting. Calvin Rudd's moral crusade, the county pressure, the hidden interests, And now a woman who disappeared at the most convenient moment for anyone who needed the past cleaned up. Evie didn't come back that week, or the next, and as the days went on, the disappearance even stopped being spoken about inside the house, not because people didn't care, because they were protecting themselves. Work demanded that everyone keep breathing, and that was what scared Lill most. The way a human being can keep going, even when something wrong has been planted right in the middle of the road. From that point on, when Lill sat at the piano and watched the parlor fill, she wasn't singing only to ease tiredness. She was singing to cover a new kind of silence, the silence that forms when a community learns it can lose someone and still sleep. And that kind of silence isn't empty. It has weight, it collects interest, and it comes back years later, when everyone has decided the subject is dead, and someone realizes the town learned how to kill without ever raising its hand. Winter hadn't truly settled in yet, but the nights already carried that dry cold that slips in through your collar without apologizing. In Silver Junction, cold wasn't like it is in a city, with people hurrying from door to door. Out there it spread like dust, found the cracks, stayed in the things, reminded you the desert doesn't give anything without collecting. The first week of December 1969, the house was running the way you run under a thin blade. After Evie disappeared, everything had tightened. Nobody laughed loud in the hallway. Nobody stayed alone out back for long. Vera kept the rhythm, but her steps carried more weight. Like each day was one more box stacked without letting it fall. Outside, the squeeze hadn't eased. New requirements, new deadlines, new recommendations for safety. The county had learned an efficient way to grind you down without getting its hands dirty. The house complied, adjusted, paid, and still the look on it didn't change. The night of the fire didn't begin with drama. It began with routine. Lill came in early, like always. The parlor was clean, wax smell on the floor, the yellow light by the piano. The air felt drier than usual, and her throat noticed. She drank water, scanned her pages, chose 2 calm openers, highway songs, old radio songs, nothing that stirred too much. The first customers walked in around 8. Mine men, a trucker, 2 strangers Lill didn't recognize who didn't stay long. Nothing seemed out of place. Vera stood behind the bar, checking the extinguishers like it was habit. The security guard stayed nearer the door than he used to. Small things, steady things. Around 10, the first warning came as a smell. Lill caught it before she saw anything. Not thick smoke, not wood burning. It was that dry electrical odor, fabric heating where it shouldn't. The smell of a clothes iron left on too long. She paused for half a breath in the middle of an chord and breathed again. It was faint, but it was real. Vera caught it too. Lill saw Vera lift her chin like she was testing the air. Without stirring panic, Vera gave the maintenance man a shorthand signal. He went down the hallway, opened a side door, and came back with a confused look. "Smells like wire," he said low. Vera didn't wait. "Kitchen's closed. Nobody uses the stove," she said. Then to the security guard, quieter, "Go outside and check the panel. Now." For a few minutes the parlor kept moving. Lill kept playing, but her music lost its ease. She was listening more than singing, tuned to small sounds, an odd crack, a buzz, anything. In places like that, the difference between a scare and a disaster can be a minute. The guard came back running. It was the first time Lill saw real urgency in his body. "Smoke near the storage," he said to Vera. "Back end." Vera didn't shout. Vera never shouted. She did what capable people do. She moved the pieces without announcing fear. "Everybody out the front. No running." Then lower to the guard. "Grab an extinguisher and call Hank." Hank Mercer was one of those men a small town uses 3 ways without giving him a fancy title. Well, he was a volunteer fireman when the bell rang, an auto shop owner during the day, and at any hour he was the man who could tell when something didn't add up. Lill didn't know if Hank was home or at the bar, but she knew when you called Hank, it meant the situation had stepped past "let's see." Customers started filtering out, some irritated, some scared. A trucker muttered that the place was turning into a mess, but he moved anyway. An older miner helped another man who was limping. The house had evacuation rules because of the license, and that, strangely, kept it from turning into chaos. Vera had always taken safety serious because she knew the county loved an excuse. When Lill stepped away from the piano, she could feel real smoke now. Not a cloud yet, but a fast-moving thread under the ceiling, grabbing the throat. The smell was sharper, burning plastic. That's the scent that scares you most because it feels poisonous. She crossed the room and guided a newer girl who was shaking. It wasn't heroics. It was work instinct. Front door, breathe low. Don't stop in the hallway. Outside, the cold air hit her face like a clean slap. She coughed, heart racing, not from fear of dying, but from that practical panic of realizing the thing that held your life upright was inside those walls. That's when she saw smoke pushing from the back, near the storage area, and an orange pulse starting to throb through a crack, like the building was breathing fire. Hank arrived too fast for a man who'd supposedly just been called without sirens. That was the first thing Lill noticed. His small volunteer truck came hard down the road, engine yelling, and Hank jumped out, already pulling hose and barking orders. 2 other men with him. He didn't look surprised. He looked ready. "Where's it at?" He called straight to Vera. Vera pointed, her face steady, but her eyes giving away what she was watching. Her life's work turning to ash. Hank ran to the back. Lill stayed near the parking lot with the others, watching because she couldn't make herself stand still. She saw the security guard try an extinguisher at the side, but the smoke was too thick. The fire had found what it loves: paper, fabric, cleaning products, things that catch and don't ask. Then came a sound you never forget, a loud crack, followed by a short, hollow whoosh, like the air got shoved. A back window blew out, and a flame shot up like a hungry tongue. "Back up," Hank shouted, and the word cut the night. From then on, there wasn't, "We'll control it." There was, "We'll keep it from spreading to everything." Hank and the others fought it, water running, smoke rising, steam mixing with the cold. But the building had old sections, patched and repatched over the years. Fire in a place like that finds pathways the way a rat does. Lill saw Vera put a hand on the front door frame like she could hold the whole place up with her body. For a second, Vera was just a woman watching her livelihood burn. Then she was the manager again, counting heads, checking no one was still inside, making sure nobody had dropped in a room and been forgotten. That's what you do when you can't control flames. You control what you can. The police arrived later. They always arrive later. A sheriff's car rolled up with bright headlights, and 2 men stepped out wearing authority, like it could put out fire. They spoke with Hank, spoke with Vera, stared at the burning building with an expression that wasn't sorrow. It was calculation. Lill stood outside for more than an hour, shaking without realizing she was shaking. Cold seeped in, smoke clung to her hair, and a bitter taste sat in her mouth. She stared at the parlor that had been her stage and saw only broken light, shadows moving, water sliding down the front like sweat. At some point, Hank came back from the rear, face smeared with soot, and stopped near Vera. They spoke low. Lill drifted close enough to catch only pieces, but the pieces were enough. "This," Hank said, then stopped. This started too fast. Vera didn't ask what he meant. She already understood. "You sure?" she asked, like she needed a firm word before she carried it. Hank looked toward the area where the fire seemed to have begun and shook his head slow. "I'm not saying anything out loud," he said. "I'm just saying you can feel some things, and tonight's got the smell of something arranged." He didn't say gasoline. He didn't say sabotage. He didn't say a name. In Silver Junction, a direct accusation was a door you didn't open unless you knew you could close it again. But his sentence stayed there like a rock in a pocket. When the flames finally gave way to water and lack of air, what remained was a wounded building, still steaming. Sections of roof collapsed, the inside destroyed enough to make any reopening a fantasy. And along with the burned wood went things that wouldn't come back. Records, folders, logbooks, papers the county had been demanding with steady insistence, notes, receipts, letters, and maybe other traces nobody said out loud, but everybody understood. By morning, the story was already moving. Accidental fire at licensed establishment. The local paper printed a small, blurry photo of smoke. The radio spoke of a tragedy, thankfully with no injuries. The preacher mentioned purification without using the word, but he put the idea where people could pick it up. The cruelest part was seeing how quickly the town adjusted to the new story, like the fire had solved an annoyance, like it was a blessing in disguise. 2 days later, Lill walked down Main Street and heard a woman say, with a voice that held relief, "Well, at least that's over now." Not anger, satisfaction. A sense of duty done without dirty hands. Vera didn't cry in public. She stood on the burned ground with Hank and the security man and looked at what was left. Then she said, simple as a ledger entry, "They couldn't shut me down on paper, so they shut me down with fire." Lill stood there, coat tight, breathing air that still tasted wrong, and she understood with a sick clarity that the fire wasn't only the loss of a job, it was a message to anyone still thinking about resisting, a message to anyone who remembered too much, and most of all, a message to the town. If anybody started asking questions about inspections, about pressure, about Evie, someone could point at the ashes and say the answers were lost in an accident. That night, Lill didn't sing. There was nowhere to sing. She sat in her rented room and stared at her hands, smelling smoke that hot water couldn't wash away. And for the first time since she'd come to Silver Junction, she asked herself, not as a worker, but as a woman, what happens to you when the place where you existed gets erased? The fire took the parlor, but what it was trying to take, really, was the memory. After the fire, Silver Junction went back to looking normal faster than it should have. That was the first shock to Lill. Not the flames, not the smoke, not the water running down the front like cold sweat, but the speed with which the town found a way to keep moving, like what burned was only an old building out by the highway. The next week, the property sat taped off and surrounded by talk. The county sent a man to assess damages. The sheriff sent a deputy to take names and ask questions that sounded routine, but carried the tone of someone already holding the answer he wanted. Hank Mercer still showed up now and then, staring at the ashes with the same expression you wear when you're looking at an engine you know has been tampered with. You can feel it's been touched, but proving it is another thing. Vera Doss handled what she had to handle the way she handled a cash drawer. She filled out forms, signed statements, handed over what they asked for, and when they asked for things that no longer existed, she answered with the same calm every time. Burned. That word became both shield and trap. A shield because it stopped certain demands. A trap because it also erased the chance to challenge whatever version got written later. The fire left an empty spot where truth could be shaped. For Lill, consequences started with the simplest thing. She lost her job overnight. When you live off wages and tips, you don't have much padding. She paid rent for her room, bought food, put a little aside when she could, but nobody saves enough to have everything vanish all at once. In the first days, she walked the town like she was looking for a door that wasn't there. She went to the bar on Main Street and asked if they needed music. The owner said no. Business was weird lately, and he wouldn't hold her eyes. She asked the little motel if they needed someone to sing in a lounge. They didn't even have a lounge. She stopped by a shop and offered to help answer phones, organize, clean. The man said maybe, and never called. It wasn't only that there weren't openings. It was the smell. In a small town, the smell of a place clings to you. The house was gone, but the mark of it stayed on everyone who'd worked there. To some people that meant shame. To others it meant risk. And risk is something practical folks avoid, even if they can't put into words why. One morning at the grocery, Lill passed two women she knew only by face. They were talking about the highway revitalization, about how now we can build something decent out there. When they saw Lill, they gave that short smile that isn't kindness, it's formality. One of them said, "Such a shame what happened, but maybe it was for the best." So, right, it came wrapped like sympathy, but it tasted like a sentence. For the best meant less embarrassing for us. Lill left with a loaf of bread and an urge to laugh. No joy in it, just the kind of laugh that rises when injustice is so common it starts feeling like furniture. She didn't answer, not because she lacked words, because in Silver Junction, answering meant opening yourself to a kind of war you couldn't win. Vera changed too. At first she tried to keep the women together, organized, like there was still a house to run. She talked about lawyers, about insurance, about reopening somewhere else, but every step she took met an invisible wall. Insurance wanted a report. A report wanted proof. The proof had burned. The county recommended waiting for an investigation. The investigation dragged on with a helpful slowness. The sheriff said there were no signs of a crime. When Hank heard that, he'd clamp his jaw and stay quiet. Then came the visits. Earl Sutter appeared again like an old friend, offering options with the same cold smile. "You can get out of this with minimal pain," he told Vera, "if you sign what needs signing." Vera answered with a line Lill never forgot, because it sounded like something snapping inside without making a sound. "Pain I already have. What you're offering is silence." Earl didn't take offense. Men like him don't get offended. They just take notes. "Silence is useful," he said, and left like he was setting down a business card on a table. After that, the pressure changed shape. Before, it was paperwork. Now it was isolation. People began treating Vera like she was a walking problem. A supplier who'd still worked with her stopped returning calls. A county man who used to nod on the street turned his face away. One day, somebody scratched "Sinner" into the side of an employee's car. Vandalism dressed up as morality. That's when Lill felt what the punishment really was. In small town, punishment is rarely jail. Punishment is being shut out, being turned into a shadow at your own address. Evie's disappearance, which already hurt, turned into a deeper, bitter ache, because now it felt buried for good. The house had burned. The town had turned the page. And any question about Evie got met with the same ready line, like it had been practiced. She left. They always leave. When Lill tried to remind people of details, the coat still in the locker, the things left behind, folks changed the subject or gave her that pity face, like she was clinging to something unhealthy. It was a polite way of saying stop. One late afternoon, Lill found Hank outside his shop, hands greasy, eyes hard. She asked low, "You think anybody's ever going to talk?" Hank wiped his hands on a rag and took his time answering. "Talk?" he repeated. "Here, people talk when they're already leaving or when they think they're above everything." He looked down the highway toward the edge of town where the sun fell and turned the world orange. "And even then," he said, "sometimes when they talk, nobody listens." That line stuck to Lill because it wasn't comfort. It was fact. Days turned into weeks. Her rented room started to feel smaller. She began counting her money more often and buying less. She cut good coffee and bought the cheap kind. Cut meat and bought beans. Walked more to save gas. That kind of adjustment is humiliating, not because it's hard, but because it's quiet. You do it and no one sees. And when you're alone, silence is where shame grows. Then reputation began pressing on her the way she'd feared it would. A man at the bank who used to treat her neutral started speaking to her like he was doing her a favor. The preacher saw her once and offered a smile and said, "God gives us chances to start over." It sounded kind, but it carried condemnation. In that town, start over meant erase yourself, apologize for having work. Lill didn't apologize, but she also couldn't stay. Silver Junction didn't expel her with a sign. It expelled her with closed doors and turned eyes. Vera said it first, one cold night when they sat outside Hank's shop, breathing winter air mixed with someone else's cigarette smoke. "They're going to win their way," Vera said, "not because they're right, because they're organized." Lill looked toward the highway and watched headlights pass, like the town's life would go on without them. "So what do we do?" she asked. Vera waited a moment. When she answered, there was no drama. "We survive." Then she looked straight at Lill, "and we remember." The second part was quieter, not a threat, a promise. And that's when Lill understood the consequences weren't only financial, they were about identity. She was going to carry what she'd seen, what she couldn't prove, what had been erased. She would carry the name people didn't say, the disappearance the town swallowed, The fire that just happened, and carrying that in a place where everyone prefers forgetting. That's a loneliness you can't explain to someone who's never lived it. The week before Christmas, Lill packed what she had, what fit. She didn't announce it on Main Street. No need. Silver Junction wasn't going to miss her. She stopped by Hank's shop to say goodbye and left a short note for Vera, because Vera had too much pride for long farewells. On her last night before leaving early, Lill sat in her room with the radio low. An old song came on, one she used to sing in that parlor, and her body reacted for a second like she was about to sit at the piano. She didn't. There was no piano. No parlor, only the echo, and she understood that echo was the kind of thing that follows you for decades, because what burned wasn't just a building. It was a piece of a life, and Silver Junction wanted the ashes to be the end of the story. But for the people who lived it, ashes are never the end. They're the beginning of remembering. The years went by the way years go, when you're just trying to live. No ceremony, no soundtrack, seasons arriving and leaving like they don't owe you an explanation. Lill stayed out west, but not so far that she felt like a stranger in her own language. She moved through small towns where nobody knew her name, and at first that felt like freedom. Later it turned into plain quiet, cleaner quiet maybe, but quiet all the same. She sang in 2 roadside bars, then in a low old hotel near a highway where the customers didn't ask questions. Over time, she learned how to pick songs that didn't stir attention, how to save money for real, how to live with less without letting it feel like humiliation. She didn't tell Silver Junction stories to impress anyone. When she spoke of it at all, she did it carefully, like someone who'd watched a whole town decide the official version mattered more than what happened. But memory doesn't obey effort. It comes back on its own schedule. Late in the 70s, on a windy afternoon, Lill was working a bar lounge in Tonopah, another Nevada town, another kind of dust, when she heard someone mention Calvin Rudd, like it was old news. The men were talking county politics, council deals, a strong fellow who'd climbed the ladder and now showed up in photos with important people. Rudd was always sharp, one man said at the bar, cleaned that town up, did what nobody else would do. The word cleaned slipped into Lil's ear like smoke. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Nobody there knew she'd sung in that burned parlor, watched a man sit in the shadows, felt pressure turn from paper into fire. But his name, spoken that far away with admiration, dragged back what she'd tried to bury just to breathe. Around that same time, a package arrived in the mail with handwriting she recognized on the envelope. It was from Hank Mercer. She opened it carefully, the way you open a letter that might change your day. Inside was a folded page written by hand, and a yellowed newspaper clipping. Hank's note was short, the way he was. Lill, don't know if you want to hear anything out of Silver Junction, but I figured you ought to see this. Town's acting like it's always been the right kind of place. And there's folks getting rich off that. Take care of yourself. Hank. The clipping wasn't about the fire. It was about a revitalization project the county had approved. Shops, a larger gas station, the kind of build-out that made the town look respectable on a brochure. And on the small map printed in the article, the area included the land where Vera's house had stood. The story praised a new era, morals, and progress. Calvin Rudd's name appeared as a supporter, along with 2 others. One of those names hit Lill like a cold coin. Earl Sutter. Hank wasn't telling her anything she hadn't suspected. He was handing her confirmation. Lill stared at the paper long enough that she lost track of time. It wasn't surprise. It was closure of a door she'd still left cracked open in her mind. And sometimes that hurts more than uncertainty, because it ends the last small hope that something else might have been true. Still, that wasn't the kind of revelation people imagine. It wasn't a confession with spotlight and handcuffs. It was a clear picture of the machine that had always been running. What came later, months later, was stranger, smaller, the kind of truth that shows up not in court, but in the wrong conversation at the wrong moment. By then, Lill was working 2 nights a week in an old highway hotel lounge. One night, a man walked in and sat alone away from the stage. He had the look of a retired county employee, back straight, Hair trimmed close, shirt too clean for a man who didn't need to impress anymore, eyes that still measured a room by habit. Lill sang her set. During the break, she went to the bar for water, and the man came over like he wanted to talk about music. "You sing nice," he said, low. "Thank you," Lill said, polite, not inviting more. He waited a beat, then tested the ground. "You ever sing in Silver Junction?" The question was so direct, her body stiffened before her mind could decide what to do. She didn't show it on her face. She answered the way a survivor answers. "I've been through a lot of towns." The man nodded like that was enough, but he didn't walk away. "I worked out there. County-side," he said, and his voice carried something like confession. "Saw things I wasn't supposed to see. Saw people who weren't supposed to disappear." Lill didn't ask who. She already knew, and even knowing, she felt her stomach drop. He took a drink and kept his eyes on the glass. "When the place burned, I was in the office that week. We got paperwork before it happened. Paper that wasn't supposed to exist. A zoning change request, and a list of violations that looked designed to wear the owner down, all stamped and signed quick, too quick." He looked up at her. There was shame in his face, not fear. "Shame. You know how it is," he said. "The world doesn't need much. It just needs 3 men agreeing, and a 4th man pretending he didn't see." Lill stood there with her water glass held steady. Part of her wanted to leave. Part of her wanted to ask every question at once. But the Lill who'd made it this far had learned not to offer herself to danger out of duty. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. He let out a slow breath. "Because I'm old," he said, "and because I saw a girl. Evie, was it?" He said her name like he was pulling a stone out of his throat. "I saw her name on an internal note before everything got clean. A deputy brought a message to someone in the county office. It wasn't a report, it was a message. And 2 days later, they said she'd left." He shook his head slowly. "I don't have proof, never did. Back then I had a family, a job. I had fear, and fear's a creature that makes you call cowardice being careful." Lill listened without letting her face change. She didn't feel relief. She felt weight, because what he was offering wasn't justice. It was coherence. And coherence is sometimes the only thing life gives you. He didn't say, "Rudd did it." He didn't say, "Harlan ordered it." He didn't need to. In a small town, the map doesn't require a legend. Before he went back to his table, he left her with one line. "Mr. Rudd, he always wanted to look clean. And there's people who, to look clean, push the dirt under somebody else." Then he walked out, like he'd never been there. Lill stood there, looking at the door, her heart too calm for what she'd just heard. She understood why that kind of confession comes late. It comes when a man feels safer, when the risk of consequence is smaller. That's part of the same machine too, but the words existed now, and that was enough to light something in her she'd kept dim on purpose. The human need to name what happened. That night, back in her room, she took Hank's note and the old clipping and put them in a plain folder. Not a case file, not a threat, just her way of saying to herself, "I didn't imagine it." In the months after, other scraps showed up. An older trucker recognized her voice and said he'd been through Silver Junction the year the place burned. A remark about the sheriff looking the other way in exchange for support. A small news item that Wade Harlan had retired and moved to another county, quiet, no fanfare, and in a statewide paper, a photo of Calvin Rudd, smiling beside people with bigger titles, looking like a man who'd never had shadows. None of it brought justice. None of it brought Evie back. None of it rebuilt Vera's house. But it gave Lill something she hadn't had since 1969, the cold certainty that the town had chosen, and that the choice had been made by men with names, men with power, men who knew how to use morality as a curtain and fire as an eraser. And with that certainty came a quiet decision. Lill stopped trying to forget. She didn't become a crusader. She didn't chase revenge. She simply accepted that some stories don't end when a town decides they're over. They continue in the bodies of the people who saw. And somewhere inside her, the idea formed that one day, if not in court, if not on local radio, if not in a county meeting, she would still tell it the way she knew how, as a working woman's memory, weighted right, plain spoken, so the official version wouldn't be the only one left. Because in the end, That was the only justice she could carry. Remember it whole, and don't call ashes clean up. Lill went back to Silver Junction many years later, when time had done what it always does, softened the sharp edges of anger, thickened the edges of longing, and made the truth hurt in a quieter way. She didn't go back for revenge. She didn't go back to stand in front of a church door and stare anyone down. She went back because at a certain age you start to understand there are places that keep living inside you, even when you swear you left them. It was a clear morning, big sky, that desert blue that never looks real. She drove in alone on the same highway that used to carry her to work. The radio played low, more out of habit than for company. When the Silver Junction sign came up, her body reacted before her mind did. A small tightening, like a hand closing slowly around something old. The town looked different on the surface. That showed right away at the edge. There was a bigger gas station with newer pumps and a bright sign, and a strip of small shops selling road things. Coffee, souvenirs, packaged sandwiches. Main Street was tidier, less weathered wood, more fresh paint. The sidewalks looked redone. There were welcome signs and community pride slogans, like the town had learned how to talk pretty to people who pass through. And still, the air was the same. The way people looked at you was the same. That quick measure, that silent weighing, that question without words. Who are you? What are you doing here? Silver Junction had gotten better for pictures, but it was still the kind of place where reputation is currency and silence is law. Lill parked near the grocery. The storefront was new, but the building was the same, and went inside to buy a bag of coffee more out of ritual than need. The young man at the register wouldn't know her, but an older woman in line behind her looked twice. Not because she recognized Lill for certain. Recognition in a small place often comes as a feeling more than proof, but because something about her didn't fit the present. You visiting? The woman asked, voice neutral. Just passing through, Lill said. It was the right answer. Just passing through opens doors without promising anything. The woman nodded but kept looking, like she was trying to place Lill on an old map. Lill paid and walked out slow. Outside, the wind carried away the coffee smell and brought others. Gasoline, dust, rubber, road smells. A town that lived off movement. She drove to where Vera's place had stood. The land wasn't empty anymore. Where the parlor had been, where the piano had sat, there was now parking, and the side of a shop. Clean, appropriate. A big sign read Silver Junction Travel Mart with patriotic lettering and a flag snapping in the wind, as if to say this was a decent place now. Lill stood at the edge of that lot and thought one simple thing. This is where we lived, and now they sell coffee and keychains on top of it. She didn't feel rage. She felt a dry sadness, almost respectful, not for the place, but for the people who'd been erased, so the place could be called clean. She walked toward the far corner by a low fence and stopped like someone visiting a grave with no marker. There was nothing to see, just asphalt, painted lines, and the steady noise of cars coming and going. And still, she saw Vera behind the bar, steady hands, low voice, solving trouble without spectacle. She saw Evie's quick laugh in the hallway, hair pinned in a hurry. She saw Hank with soot on his face saying, "Started too fast." She saw Calvin Rudd's eyes in the parlor, warning, not desire. All of it lived clearer inside her than any new sign. A man stepped out of the store and lit a cigarette near the door, middle-aged, working build, the stance of someone who thinks he owns the space. He watched Lill the way small-town men watch anyone standing still too long. "You looking for somebody?" he asked, already carrying suspicion. Lill met his eyes, calm. "No," she said, "just remembering." He frowned like remembering was a strange word. "Ain't nothing here to remember," he said, and took a drag. He didn't mean it as cruelty. He meant it as reflex, as culture, and that's what struck Lill hardest. After all those years, Silver Junction still had people willing to deny the past, because denial is easier than looking at it. "There is," Lill said, quiet, just not on the ground. The man blew smoke and shrugged, like he'd decided she wasn't worth the trouble. and went back inside. Lill stayed a little longer. Then she got back in the car and drove slow along Main Street. The church stood there. New windows now. The bank. Modern sign. The county building. Same bones. Different paint. Everything had been fixed up without changing how it worked. She stopped at an intersection and watched people for a few minutes. Men drifting out of the bar in the middle of the day, talking loud. A family crossing the street with a small child. A sheriff's car rolling past slow, same as it used to, like time didn't have power over certain habits. Then she saw the name on a small sign by the county building, Rudd Community Hall. It almost made her smile. In that bitter way. The town had put his name on a public building like an honor. The last name sat there clean and official, like it belonged to a man who'd served. Lill didn't go inside. There was no point. The sign said plenty. Silver Junction had chosen what kind of story it wanted to tell about itself. The winner's story, not the burned one. Late afternoon, she drove to the small cemetery at the edge of town, not because she expected to find Evie. Evie didn't have a headstone there, and that absence was part of the tragedy. She went because a cemetery is where names stay once life can't argue anymore. She found Hank Mercer's stone that she hadn't expected. The marker was simple, the way he would have wanted. Lill stood there a long moment. She didn't cry. She just placed her hand against the cold stone. A quiet thank you without words. Vera wasn't there. Maybe she died somewhere else. Maybe she was still alive in some other town that didn't keep her name. Lill didn't know. And there was something fitting in that. The people who hold things up often disappear without a parade. Back in the car, the sky was turning. Pink on the horizon. The day folding in. Lill sat with her hands on the wheel and breathed. She thought about what the town had done. The pressure, the disappearance, the fire, the revitalization. She thought about Calvin Rudd's name, now printed on a plaque, like morality had won. And in the middle of it came a truth that didn't feel like a lesson, just a plain fact. Silver Junction hadn't gotten purer. It had gotten better dressed. She drove out of town without hurry, leaving the way she'd learned to arrive, quiet, not drawing attention. On the highway, she picked up speed and felt the desert open again, sky wide, wind dry. The radio caught a weak station playing an old song, one she used to sing back in that parlor. For a second, her voice wanted to join it. She let a line come out, low, only for herself. It wasn't missing the place. It was missing who she'd been before she learned certain things, before Silver Junction disappeared in her mirror. Lill said a sentence no one else could hear, not for the town, for her own order. Like Vera kept her bar, like Hank kept his engines. Some places only changed the paint. She kept driving, and the name Silver Junction turned to dust behind her. But what happened there didn't turn to dust, not for the ones who lived it, because when a story is true, distance doesn't dissolve it. It only makes it quieter, waiting to be remembered the right way. And even without a courtroom, without a headline, Lill carried the only justices she ever managed to hold, the whole memory, plain and unpolished. The rest she left the town to keep.